Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be a family gathering, until my son took my plate and said, "You've had enough, old lady." I smiled, but inside a decision had already been made. By the end of the night, the mortgage payment he thought was his was mine to take, and his last name, gone from the trust, never to return. For years I gave him everything. Now it was time for him to learn the cost of taking me for granted. The documents would answer for him when he came to claim what he thought was still owed. We're just getting started, but before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from? These stories aren't just mine, they're mirrors. Drop your city in the comments, and if you believe in second chances, hit subscribe. The kitchen was warm, the savory smells of turkey and stuffing filling the air as Margaret moved about, preparing the final touches for Thanksgiving dinner. She worked with a quiet energy, enjoying the rhythmic motion of chopping, stirring, and seasoning, a small smile tugging at her lips as she imagined the family arriving soon. It had been months since they had all gathered in her home, and she was eager to see them. Her son Zach and his wife Claire were bringing the grandkids. She could already picture their laughter filling the house, the noise of the little ones running around. It would be just like old times. Margaret had always taken pride in these family dinners. It was her role to make sure everything was perfect. Her chance to show them all that she still had it. But as she stirred the gravy, a small knot of anxiety settled in her stomach. She didn't know why, but this year felt different. It was subtle. Just a feeling that she couldn't shake, like the floor beneath her feet was shifting, and she couldn't quite find solid ground. The doorbell rang, and she snapped out of her reverie, hurrying to open the door. Zach was standing there, tall and broad-shouldered as ever, holding the hand of his wife Claire, who smiled warmly. Behind them, the kids were already wriggling with excitement. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," Zach said, pulling her into a quick hug. Margaret smiled, kissing his cheek. "I'm so glad you could make it. Dinner's almost ready." The kids rushed past her, excited to explore the house, their little feet pattering on the hardwood floor. Claire gave her a knowing look and followed them, already on her way to the kitchen to help with the final preparations. But Zach remained standing in the hallway, shifting from foot to foot. It wasn't his usual warm welcome. There was a distracted energy about him, like he was already thinking of the next thing. Margaret tried to ignore the twinge in her chest as she ushered him toward the dinner table. "You're looking good, Zach," she said, trying to make small talk. He gave her a half smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, Mom." As they sat down, the tension felt palpable, though Margaret couldn't quite put her finger on it. Claire and Zach took their seats, and the kids were soon seated at the little table, chattering away, oblivious to the adults' quiet unease. Dinner progressed with the usual rhythm. Plates were passed, stories were shared, and the food was devoured with familiar gusto. But throughout it all, Margaret felt a growing sense of being overlooked. As the conversation flowed between Claire and Zach, she noticed that her opinion was no longer a part of it. They made decisions without asking her, laughed off her suggestions, and it felt as though she was fading into the background of her own home. Finally, as Margaret was about to take a bite of her own plate, she felt Zach's hand reach across the table. Without warning, he scooped up her plate and slid it away from her. "You've had enough, old lady," he said with a grin, his voice dripping with an almost playful condescension. Margaret's stomach dropped, her heart skipping a beat. She forced a laugh, pretending to take the joke in stride, but inside a deep pang of humiliation spread through her chest. The words echoed in her ears, making her feel small in a way that she hadn't felt in years. It was a joke, but the sting of it was real. Claire laughed, her voice light and airy, as though the moment was nothing more than a funny family quirk. "You really can't keep up anymore, huh?" she added, her smile too bright, her tone just a little too sweet. Margaret forced another smile, fighting the tears that threatened to form in her eyes. She tried to hide the hurt, to make it seem like it was all fine, but deep down she could feel the edges of her existence being chipped away. She had been doing this, hosting, cooking, making sure everyone was comfortable for so long, but now it seemed like her place was slipping away from her. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of strained conversations, with Margaret quietly observing the growing divide between her and the people she loved most. It wasn't the big things. There were no loud fights or dramatic confrontation. It was the small things, the subtle shifts that made her feel invisible, like a cherished object, slowly gathering dust on a shelf. After dinner, as the kids ran off to play in the backyard, and Claire and Zach retreated to the living room, Margaret stayed behind, her hands resting on the edge of the kitchen counter. The quiet of the house seemed to swallow her whole, the silence louder than anything. She wasn't sure how long she stood there before her hand brushed against the edge of a drawer. Her fingers paused, a shiver running down her spine. There, beneath a pile of old recipe cards and napkins, were the family trust papers, papers she had once signed without thinking. The realization hit her hard. The documents that held the family's future, the decisions that had been made long ago without her input, without her understanding. She had never questioned them before, but now, everything felt different. Now, it felt like something she needed to understand, something that had been kept from her. Her pulse quickened as she pulled open the drawer, the papers inside seeming to glow in the dim light of the kitchen. This was it. This was where everything changed. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she cleared the dinner table. She moved methodically, trying to keep herself busy, trying to shake off the weight of Zach's words. "You've had enough, old lady." The words had been flippant, coated with laughter, but they felt like a blow. She should have laughed it off, but it had pierced something deep inside her. She had always put others first. Her children, her husband, her family, every holiday, every meal, every moment had been dedicated to them. But tonight, something had shifted. That offhand comment, combined with Claire's mocking smile, had felt like the final straw. Margaret walked into the kitchen, her hands still mechanically wiping down the countertop. The sounds of laughter and chatter drifted from the living room, where Zach and Claire were still talking, the kids running around, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that had settled like a heavy fog in the house. Margaret's eyes darted over the room, trying to focus on something, anything, that could distract her from the growing sense of invisibility. She had always been the glue, the one who held it all together. Yet tonight, as she stood in her own kitchen, it was clear that no one noticed her anymore. The silence was deafening. Her thoughts drifted back to the countless times she had sacrificed for Zach. The late nights, the missed celebrations, the constant adjustments she'd made to accommodate him and his family. She had been there when he needed her. She had put his needs first, no matter the cost. And for what? So he could take her plate like an afterthought, dismiss her with a throwaway comment that cut deeper than anything he'd ever said before. Margaret set the dish towel down, feeling her chest tight. She thought back to all the years she had poured herself into him, all the times she had given without asking for anything in return. There had been moments of joy, certainly, moments of laughter, of connection, but now, standing in this kitchen, the harsh reality hit her. I was no longer needed. The realization hit harder than any of the years of caregiving, harder than the endless laundry or the countless meals. It was the emotional neglect, the years of being unseen in her own family, that had finally taken its toll. She had been used, not just for her resources, but for her emotions too. She had been the safety net, the one who caught everyone when they fell, but in doing so, she had lost herself. The soft murmur of voices in the other room reached her ears. Claire's voice broke through, just loud enough to be heard over the others. "She really can't keep up anymore, huh?" It was as though the words hung in the air, dripping with judgment. Claire's tone had been light, but there was something cutting beneath it. A part of Margaret wanted to march into the living room and confront them both, to demand that they see her, that they acknowledge everything she had done for them, but she didn't. She stayed in the kitchen, her back to the world, pretending she didn't hear. But inside, the quiet rage was building. Zach wandered into the kitchen a few minutes later, his footsteps hesitant, like he knew something was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. He leaned against the doorway, looking at his mom, his brow furrowed. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the counter like he was trying to read her mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than before. "Mom, I've been thinking, things are tough for Claire and me right now. I don't know how we're going to keep everything afloat with the bills stacking up. We've been trying, but Margaret didn't need to hear the rest. He was always asking for help, always looking for a way to offload his burdens onto her. She had been the one to bail him out again and again. And yet, In this moment, when she was the one who needed help, the one who needed to be seen, he took her plate away without a second thought. Her chest tightened, and her hands clenched into fists, nails biting into the palms of her hands. Enough, she thought. Enough of this. Enough of being the one who's always there for everyone else, while I'm left to fade into the background. She turned to him, her voice steady but cold. Zach, I'm not your bank. I'm not your safety net anymore. She held up her hand to stop him from speaking. You've taken enough from me. Zach looked taken aback, his face going slightly pale. Mom, I know, Zach. Her voice was sharp now, the edge of years of quiet resentment cutting through. You've been taking from me for years, and I've let you. I've sacrificed everything for you. But this is where it ends. Zach opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't let him. I'm done, Zach, she said firmly, stepping away from him. I've spent my life supporting everyone else, and I've let myself disappear in the process. But no more. It's time I took control too. Margaret walked toward the kitchen drawer, her fingers brushing against the cold metal handles. She knew what was inside. The family trust papers that had been signed years ago, without her true understanding of what they meant. Papers that had tied her to the family, and yet left her with no voice. She opened the drawer, pulling out the documents with a steady hand. Her eyes skimmed over them. The reality of it hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She had been trapped, not just by the family, but by her own complacency. Without a second thought, she pulled out her phone and texted her lawyer, Helen, we need to talk tomorrow. I'm ready to make some changes. The phone buzzed with a response moments later. I'll be at your place tomorrow, ready to discuss everything. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The power was in her hands now. She had been a caregiver, a servant to her family's needs, but now it was her turn to take control, and she would do it on her terms. The storm inside her was only beginning. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the legal papers spread out before her like a map to a future she could barely see. The family trust documents, papers she had signed so many years ago, without really understanding what they meant, now lay in front of her like a lifeline. The heavy weight of it all had taken its toll, and for the first time Margaret wasn't sure if she was ready to make the kind of decision she knew would change everything. The doorbell rang, a brief interruption to the heavy silence of the house. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady for just a moment, then walked toward the door. She knew who it was before she even reached for the handle. Helen, her lawyer and now her guide through the minefield of family dynamics she had been trapped in for far too long. Helen's face was soft with concern, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She knew what this meeting meant. Margaret, she said, her voice warm but measured, I'm here to help you with this. Are you sure about the direction you want to take? Margaret opened the door and stepped aside to let Helen in. I'm sure, she replied, her voice steady, but the reality of what she was about to do still held a certain gravity. Helen nodded and followed her into the kitchen, where the papers were waiting. Okay, let's go over everything again just to make sure you're clear on your options. Margaret sat down at the table, pushing aside the remnants of her lunch to make room for the documents. Helen sat across from her, spreading the papers out carefully, each one a symbol of both freedom and pain. You still have control over the family home, Helen began, her finger tracing the legal lines. The trust is set up in a way that allows you to make decisions regarding the property, including who can live there. She paused, giving Margaret a long, steady look. Zach has been living in the house for years, but that could change, Margaret. You can take him off the trust entirely, if that's what you want. The words hit like a punch, but they weren't unwelcome. In fact, part of Margaret was relieved to finally have the power to make this choice. Zach had been living rent-free in the family home for years, and while she had always believed in helping him, something inside her had shifted. She had given him everything, her time, her love, her resources, and in return he had taken her for granted. Zach has had enough, Margaret said softly, her gaze locked on the papers in front of her. He's taken enough from me. It's time for him to learn responsibility. Helen met her eyes with a careful look of caution. Are you sure? Mark, you know this could cause irreparable damage to your relationship. Taking him off the trust, well, that's not something that can be undone easily. It could cause a rift that might never heal. Margaret felt the weight of Helen's words, but there was no hesitation in her now. I've already been through enough with him, she said, her voice low but resolute. I've been supporting him my whole life. He doesn't need me to rescue him anymore. Helen studied her for a moment longer, then sighed. Okay, I'll prepare the documents for you to sign, but just know this isn't something to do lightly. Margaret nodded, her chest tight, but there was a new sense of strength rising within her. For the first time, she felt the power of choice at her fingertips. She wasn't going to be the martyr anymore. She wasn't going to be the one who always sacrificed, who always bent to the will of others. This was her time, her moment to stand firm, to claim back what had been hers all along. Minutes later, the papers were signed. Margaret's signature was firm, her hand no longer trembling. As she laid down the pen, she realized that this wasn't just about the house, or the trust, or even Zach. It was about reclaiming her own life, her autonomy. The years of being the invisible one, the one who was always there for everyone else. Those years were over. She had taken back control, and no one would take that from her. She felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't realized was there had been lifted. The tension in her shoulders, the constant anxiety of wondering if she was enough, gone. She had stood up for herself. For once she had put herself first. Her phone buzzed, interrupting the quiet satisfaction that settled in the room. Margaret glanced down at the screen and saw Zach's name flash across it. He had left her a voicemail. Margaret's heart sank as she pressed play. Mom, we need to talk, Zach's voice said, his tone heavy, almost pleading. I know things have been strained between us, but I'm worried. Please, I just want to meet. Can we talk, please? Margaret stared at the phone, her mind racing. She had made her decision, and Zach's attempt to pull her back in felt like a last-ditch effort to hold on to control. He's trying to manipulate me again, she thought. But I'm not going back. Not this time. Her fingers hovered over the phone, but something inside her told her to ignore the call, to leave it unanswered. The decision had been made. There was no more room for compromise, no more place for Zach's demands in her life. With a firm resolve, Margaret set the phone down and looked at the family trust papers again. This was it. She had changed the course of her life. But just as she stood, ready to walk away from the past, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Zach. It was a message from Helen. I've reviewed the trust, Margaret. I think we need to prepare for a fight. Zach might not take this sitting down. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The storm was just beginning. Margaret stood at the door of Zach's house, her hand hovering over the knocker. Her heart raced, but her mind was resolute. She had made her decision, and now it was time to face the consequences of it. The door swung open, revealing Zach, his expression guarded, like he already knew this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. His eyes scanned her face, but he didn't say anything immediately. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Zach cleared his throat, stepping aside to let her in. Come on in, he muttered, his voice tight. Margaret walked past him, her steps measured, but her pulse quickening with every step. Zach led her to the kitchen, where the familiar smell of coffee lingered in the air. He pulled out a chair for her, but she didn't sit. Instead, she leaned against the counter, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She could feel the weight of everything in the room, the tension thick in the air. You're really going to do this, huh? Zach asked, his voice laced with disbelief as he poured himself a cup of coffee. You've been avoiding me for days, and now this? Why are you being so difficult, Mom? Margaret took a deep breath, looking him squarely in the eye. I've made some changes to the family trust, she said, her voice calm but firm. You're no longer part of it. Zach froze, the mug in his hand pausing midway to his lip. He blinked, as if trying to process her words, and then he let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tinged with something close to disbelief. This is our family, Mom. You can't just cut me off like that. Margaret's eyes didn't waver. I can, and I have, she said. You've taken from me for years, Zach. Now it's time for you to face the consequences. She watched as the shift happened on his face, first confusion, then anger. He set the cup down on the counter with a sharp clink, his jaw tightening. You're ruining everything, Mom, he spat. The family's falling apart, and you're just making it worse. You can't do this. You're supposed to be the one holding everything together. Margaret could feel the walls closing in, but she stood her ground, her posture never faltering. No, Zach. I was the one holding everything together, but you weren't even looking. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them, but her voice remained level, controlled. I've spent my life doing what everyone else needed. You, your father, Claire, everyone, but I've finally put myself first. Zach's face reddened, his eyes flashing with frustration. You're just going to leave us all behind? Like you're some kind of martyr? He scoffed, his voice rising. Do you really think you've been the only one struggling? I've had to put up with your nagging, your expectations, your guilt trips. I've had enough of it. Margaret clenched her fists at her sides, the anger threatening to rise, but she held it back. She wasn't going to let him provoke her. You think I'm just some obstacle in your ways? Her voice was low now, the calmness betraying the fury just beneath the surface. I've spent my whole life sacrificing for you, and you still don't get it. I don't need to be your punching bag anymore. Zach took a step back, as if the words hit him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped, his words faltering. The tension hung heavy between them, like a wire stretched too thin, about to snap. Finally he spoke, his voice dripping with frustration. You're going to regret this. You can't just throw everything away. I'll have to. He stopped short, the words dangling in the air, like a threat, the anger simmering beneath the surface. You'll be the one who's alone, Mom. You've isolated yourself from everyone. Margaret didn't flinch. She'd been alone for a long time, even when she had been surrounded by family. No, Zach, she said, her tone steady. I've finally learned to be okay with being alone, because I'm no longer waiting for your approval. Zach's eyes narrowed, and a dark look passed across his face. Took a step forward, his posture aggressive now. If you think you can just walk away from this family and not face the consequences, you've got another thing coming, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I'll evict you from the family home. This is still my house, and I'm the one who's been holding things together. You don't get to make these decisions without me. Margaret felt the familiar pang of old fears creeping up, but this time she didn't let them take root. You think you can evict me from my own home? She asked, a slight smirk curling at the corners of her lips. You should know, I've already made arrangements. Zach's face twisted in confusion, his anger turning to frustration as he took another step toward her. What do you mean? He demanded, his voice trembling with the realization that he wasn't in control anymore. Margaret took a deep breath, meeting his eyes one last time, knowing this was the moment everything changed. I've taken back control, Zach, she said firmly, and there's nothing you can do about it. Zach stormed out of the kitchen, his fury palpable, but Margaret didn't move. She stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clenched at her sides. She had said what needed to be said. She had taken back control, but as the door slammed behind him, Margaret's phone buzzed again. It was a voicemail from Zach. She didn't have to listen. The storm had passed. And this time she wasn't afraid to face whatever came next. Zach stormed out of the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, with the force of someone who had just realized their control was slipping away. He muttered under his breath, his words incoherent but filled with anger, and Margaret didn't need to hear them. She could feel the heat of his fury, but it no longer fazed her. She had crossed a line, and for once she didn't care. She stood motionless in the kitchen, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. The weight of her decision settled around her like a warm, heavy cloak. She had done. For the first time in years she had stood up for herself, drawn a line in the sand, and said, enough. The sound of the door slamming shut was the final punctuation, the end of an era. Margaret didn't rush to check on him. She knew the anger, the drama, but the sense of liberation, the clarity in her heart, was something new, something powerful. Margaret turned to see Claire standing in the doorway, silent, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on her face. Her disapproval was palpable, her gaze cold. Claire wasn't one for confrontations, but she wasn't about to let Margaret's defiance go unnoticed either. "You really did it, huh?" Claire said quietly. Her words clipped. There was no warmth in her voice, only the unmistakable sting of judgment. Margaret met her gaze, steady, unwavering. She took a slow breath, steadying herself before speaking. "I did, and I won't apologize for it." Claire said nothing for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for something in Margaret's face, something to latch onto that would make sense of the decision. When she finally spoke again, her words were low but sharp. "You've torn this family apart. What's left for us now?" Margaret's heart twisted, but she didn't flinch. She had spent her life sacrificing for them, twisting herself into knots to keep the peace, to keep everything together. "No more. You've been complicit in everything, Claire," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying an edge of finality. "You've watched and done nothing. But that's over. Now I'm taking control." Claire's face hardened, but she didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked away, the soft thud of her footsteps disappearing down the hallway. Margaret could feel the weight of her judgment, but it no longer mattered. Claire's disappointment, her silent reproach, it couldn't touch her now. Margaret let out a breath. She didn't realize she had been holding. The kitchen was quiet, but her mind was spinning with the weight of what she had done. She was free, finally free. As she stood in the stillness of the room, the phone on the counter buzzed. The familiar ringtone pulled her from her thoughts, and she looked down to see Zach's name flashing on the screen. She had known this moment was coming. He wasn't going to let go easily. But this time, Margaret didn't hesitate. She answered the phone, her voice calm, controlled. "Zach. Mom, please. Please don't do this." Zach's voice cracked, raw with emotion. "You're making a huge mistake. I know things have been bad between us, but I'm asking you to reconsider. Don't cut me off like this. I need you." Margaret felt a flicker of something, a tug of old memories, but she refused to let it control her. She had done enough for him, too much. She had given him everything, her time, her money, her love, and it had never been enough. Now he was the one who needed to stand on his own. She paused before responding, each word deliberate. "You had your chance, Zach. Now you will learn to stand on your own. I'm done being your safety net. I'm done letting you take from me." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long and thick. Zach didn't say anything for a while. Margaret could hear him breathing, his breaths heavy, almost ragged. "I can't believe you're doing this," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I thought you cared about me." "I do care about you, Zach," Margaret said softly, the words slipping out with more tenderness than she intended. "But caring doesn't mean enabling you. It's time for you to face reality." The line went dead. Zach hadn't hung up. He had simply fallen silent. Margaret stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in her hand, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. It wasn't supposed to be this way, but she knew it had to be. For her own survival, for her peace of mind, she had to set these boundaries. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message. Margaret's heart skipped as she saw the notification. It was a message from her bank. A single line appeared. "Mortgage payment missed." Her stomach dropped. Her mind immediately started to race, but she didn't panic. Instead, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She had always been tied to this house, to this place. It had been her anchor, her responsibility. But now, even in the face of uncertainty, she felt something else. Power. Margaret checked her account again, reviewing the details, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. It wasn't just a missed payment. It was a warning, a sign that things had to change, and she had the power to make those changes. But there was a sense of fear mixed in with the power. What was she going to do now? How would she move forward without the safety net she had always provided? She didn't know yet, but for the first time, the future didn't seem as bleak. Margaret wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and no matter what came next, she knew she had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The storm inside her had only just begun. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, Margaret didn't check it. She wasn't afraid to face whatever was coming anymore. Her future was in her hand. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows on the documents in front of her. She had been staring at the phone screen for what felt like hours, the message from the bank still fresh in her mind. Mortgage payment missed. Her fingers hovered over the touchscreen, unwilling to face the truth, but unable to ignore it. She had always known Zach was struggling with money, but this was something different. This was a pattern, a deeper issue, and she was finally seeing it for what it was. She dialed the bank's number, her hands slightly trembling as the phone rang, the cold metal against her ear, feeling oddly reassuring. When the representative answered, Margaret quickly introduced herself, her voice firm but calm. "Yes, I'm calling about a mortgage issue. I've received a notice that a payment was missed. Could you provide me with more details?" The response came quickly. The woman on the other end spoke in a polite, neutral tone, but the information was damning. Zach had missed several payments over the past few months. Each one had been delayed, and now the mortgage was behind by a significant amount. Margaret's chest tightened as the weight of the truth hit her like a sledgehammer. Zach had been living in her home using her money, depending on her for everything, and yet he had been neglecting his responsibilities. The house, the very one she had spent her life caring for, had been slipping through her fingers. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control, about everything he had taken from her without so much as a thank you. She had allowed it for far too long. "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice low but steady as she hung up the phone. She could feel the rage building inside of her, but this time it wasn't the rage of someone who had been wronged. No, it was the righteous fury of someone who was finally reclaiming what was hers. Margaret turned to the family trust papers once again, the weight of her decision pulling her. She needed to talk to Helen. She had no illusions anymore. If Zach couldn't pay, it was time to take control of the property. This was her home, her legacy, not something to be squandered or manipulated for someone else's gain. She would no longer be the one who bailed him out. He was going to face the consequences. The phone buzzed again, and Margaret saw that it was Helen's number. Without hesitation, she picked up the call. Margaret. Helen's voice greeted her, calm but understanding. "What's happened?" "I just spoke to the bank," Margaret said, her voice thick with frustration but laced with clarity. "Zach's been behind on his payments for months. He's been living off me for so long I didn't even see it until now. I can't keep doing this. I need to take back control." There was a long pause on the other end. Helen knew Margaret well enough to know that once she made a decision, there was no going back. "What are you thinking?" Helen asked cautiously. "I'm going to send him a formal notice," Margaret said, her words coming out with a finality she hadn't anticipated. "If he doesn't pay, I'll reclaim the property. I won't let him take from me anymore." Helen was silent for a moment. Margaret could almost hear the wheels turning in her lawyer's head. "Margaret, you understand what this means, right?" she asked gently. "You're essentially cutting him off. This could create a rift that might never heal." "I've already been through the rift, Helen," Margaret replied, her voice firm now, unwavering. "I've let him take everything from me for years. I've enabled him, and now it's time for him to stand on his own." Helen sighed softly. "All right, I'll prepare the notice for you. But just know, this is a major step. There may be consequences beyond what you're prepared for." Margaret's heart beat faster as she sat back in her chair, taking in the gravity of the moment. Consequence. She had been living in the shadows of others for so long, allowing herself to be the fall guy, the caretaker, the one who never asked for anything in return. But no more. This was her time to take control. She was done making herself small to fit into their lives. After a few more minutes of conversation, they hung up and Margaret was left alone with her thoughts. Her fingers shook slightly as she typed out the formal notice to Zach, outlining what would happen if he didn't pay up. It felt cold, but necessary. This was not the letter of a mother seeking reconciliation, but a woman drawing a line. She hit send, her chest tight as she stared at the screen. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. As the hours stretched on, the house seemed quieter, emptier than it had ever been. The silence was no longer oppressive, though, for the first time in ages, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace. She had done what needed to be done. She had chosen herself. Margaret picked up the phone and saw another message from Zach. She hesitated but opened it. "I'll make you regret this, Mom." Her hand trembled as she read the words, but instead of fear, a sense of calm washed over her. She was no longer the victim in this story. She wasn't someone who could be manipulated or controlled. She had done the right thing, and she would live with the consequences, whatever they were. She placed the phone down slowly, a steady breath escaping her lips. This was just the beginning. The phone rang, breaking the silence in the room with a sharp, insistent sound. Margaret stared at the screen for a moment, her heart beating heavily in her chest. Zach's name flashed, and she knew what was coming. He wouldn't let this go easily. She swiped to answer, her hand steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. She had made her decision, but this conversation, this moment, was going to be the one that solidified everything. "Mom?" Zach's voice came through the phone, his tone tight with frustration. "What the hell is this about? What do you mean you're taking me off the truck? You can't just do that." Margaret took a deep breath, her pulse quickening but her voice unwavering. "I can, Zach," she said calmly, her words steady but carrying the weight of everything she had been holding in. "You've been neglecting your responsibilities for too long. I've been covering for you, paying your bills, covering your mistakes, but I'm not doing it anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Zach spoke again, his voice was laced with anger, tinged with something more vulnerable. "You're ruining my life, Mom. I've always had your support. You've always been there, and now just like that, you're turning your back on me." Margaret could hear the desperation in his voice, the way it cracked as he tried to hold it together. But she didn't flinch. She had heard this song before. The manipulation, the guilt trips, the endless promises. This time she wasn't buying it. "I'm not ruining your life, Zach," she said softly, but with a firm edge. "I'm teaching you to stand on your own. You've had enough of my generosity. Now you'll face the consequences." Zach's breath hitched, then he let out a harsh laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Consequences? What, you're going to leave me out in the cold? After everything I've done, after everything we've been through?" The words stung, but Margaret didn't let them affect her. She had lived through this for years, trying to carry the weight of their relationship alone. Now it was time for him to learn to carry it himself. "This isn't about punishment, Zach," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "It's about you growing up. It's about you facing reality for once." There was a long silence, the kind that stretched between them like a chasm neither of them knew how to cross. When Zach finally spoke, his voice was laced with venom. "I don't need this. I don't need you to teach me anything. I'm done. Don't bother reaching out again. You've made your choice." Margaret could feel the threat in his words, the finality in his tone. It was a gut punch, but it wasn't enough to shake her. This was what she had expected, what she had prepared herself for. He was angry, he was hurt, but for once she wasn't the one carrying the burden of that anger. "I've made my choice, Zach," she said, the words clear and definitive, "and it's time for you to make yours. Don't call me again unless it's to face the consequences of your actions." There was a click on the other end, and the line went dead. Margaret sat there for a moment, the phone still pressed to her ear, the silence hanging heavy in the air. She wasn't sure what to feel, relief, anger, sadness, but she knew one thing for sure. The battle had begun, and she wasn't backing down. She set the phone down slowly, her chest tight but her hands steady. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't going to be manipulated by his guilt. This was her life, her decision, and for the first time she felt like she was truly living it. But as she stood to walk away, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and saw it was a message from Helen. Her heart skipped, a fresh wave of anxiety creeping up. "I think I found something in the family trust documents that changes everything." Margaret's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a rush of something other than dread, a flicker of curiosity, of possibility. What had Helen found? Margaret's fingers trembled as she read the message again, the weight of her decisions shifting, the ground beneath her feet suddenly less solid. Could this be the thing that would shift the balance in ways she hadn't expected? The storm inside her had only just begun, and now there was more at stake than she had ever imagined. Margaret's phone buzzed again, this time pulling her out of her thoughts with the urgency of an incoming call. It was Helen. Margaret answered quickly, her breath catching in her throat. She had a feeling that whatever Helen was about to say would change everything. Margaret, Helen's voice came through, steady but tight with a weight of her own. I've gone over the trust documents again, and I found something you need to know. Margaret's heart skipped. What is it? There was a slight pause before Helen spoke again, as if she were gathering her words carefully. There's a clause in there, a hidden one, Margaret. If you continue to financially support Zach in any way, he's entitled to a portion of your savings. It's been there for years, buried deep in the paperwork. Margaret's hand went cold. She felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. What? The word escaped her mouth in a breathless rush, the shock of it making her stomach turn. Helen continued, her voice still firm but tinged with concern. It's all in the fine print. If you continue to cover his living expenses, his bills, anything, he's legally entitled to a share of your assets. It's all there. And from what I can see, he's been using that clause to manipulate you for a long time. Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone, the realization hitting her like a slap. All those years of giving, of sacrificing for him, Zach had been playing her this whole time. He wasn't just using her kindness, he was using the law itself to ensure that she would always be there to bail him out, to never let her go, all while taking more than she'd realized. The anger boiled up inside of her, hot and fierce. He's been using me, Margaret whispered, the betrayal sinking in deeper than she ever thought possible. All this time I thought I was helping him, but he's been manipulating me with this clause. I know, Margaret. I'm so sorry you're finding this out this way, Helen said, her tone softer now, understanding the depth of the betrayal. We can challenge it, though. We can take it to court. This clause wasn't fully disclosed, and it's highly manipulative. It may not even hold up if we push back. Margaret clenched her teeth. She could feel the weight of this new knowledge pressing against her chest. For years she had thought she was doing the right thing, supporting her son, always there for him. But in reality, she had been playing directly into his hands, never realizing the strings he had attached to her generosity. Margaret? Helen's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the conversation. Are you okay? Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. I'm not okay, Helen. I'm angry. I've been blind to all of it. She stood up from the table, pacing around the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. But I'm not going to let him do this anymore. He's been taking from me for years, and now I see how this ends now. I'm with you every step of the way, Helen reassured her, but you need to know that this could get messy. This could cause irreparable damage to your relationship with Zach. Margaret didn't hesitate. She had already lost the relationship with her son long ago. The truth was, it had been slipping away for years, with every bailout, every sacrifice. This was just the final straw. I don't care about the relationship anymore, she said, her voice firmer than she had ever heard it. I've been sacrificing my life for him. I've been enabling him to stay stuck in a cycle of dependence. I need to break free, Helen. I need to take back control. Helen sighed, a slight relief in her voice. Okay, we'll get started right away. I'll draft the necessary paperwork to challenge the clause and start preparing for a legal fight. Margaret nodded, the weight of the decision settling heavily in her chest. Send me the papers, I'll sign them. This game ends now. The phone call ended, and Margaret stood still in the kitchen, staring at the empty space in front of her. She had made her decision. She had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. But as she walked toward the kitchen drawer, where she had left the family trust papers, her phone buzzed once more. It was another message from Zach. Margaret felt a chill run through her as she glanced at the screen. The words were short, but they cut deep. "You'll regret this, Mom." Her heart skipped in her chest as the weight of his threat settled in. He was angry, but she had expected that. What she didn't expect was the sudden pang of fear that followed. Would he make good on his threats? Was this the beginning of something big? Margaret stood in the quiet of her kitchen, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand. She had taken back control, but at what cost? The storm was far from over, and the battle she had started was just beginning. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was determined. The future was hers to decide, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The weight of the decision was still heavy on Margaret's shoulders as she walked into the lawyer's office the next morning, the family trust documents clutched tightly in her hand. The air was thick with tension, the room silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Helen was already there, a stack of papers spread across the table, and Margaret could feel the gravity of the situation in the way Helen didn't immediately meet her eye. "You've made up your mind?" Helen asked quietly, her voice steady but with a hint of caution. Margaret nodded, her jaw clenched. "I've made my decision, Helen. I'm filing a legal complaint to challenge the clause. It's time I take control of my life again." Helen didn't say anything for a moment, her fingers gently tapping the pen in front of her, but Margaret could tell she understood the weight of what this would mean. It wasn't just about money or property, it was about dignity. It was about taking back what had been taken from her for so long. "All right," Helen said finally, pushing a set of papers across the table. "We'll need evidence, financial records, any correspondence that shows a pattern of manipulation, and I'll need witness statements to back up your claim." Margaret felt the knot in her stomach tighten as she considered the mountain of work ahead of her, but this was the moment she stood up for herself, for the life she deserved. She'd gathered some of the documents already, the records of Zach's missed payments, his ever-growing reliance on her for money, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She had to dig deeper, find everything, leave nothing to chance. As they began organizing the evidence, Margaret's phone buzzed again. A message from Zach, short and to the point. "You'll regret this." A flicker of doubt passed through her, but she shook it off. She had heard his threats before, but they no longer held the same weight. He was trying to manipulate her again, to make her second-guess her choices. But Margaret wasn't going to back down. Weeks passed, and the preparations for the court battle took over her life. Every night, after her regular work, she stayed up late, sorting through the documents, making copies and organizing the mountain of evidence. The air in her home felt different now, charged with the electricity of her determination. Zach's calls became more frequent, his messages more insistent, but Margaret refused to engage. She had made it clear, this was her decision, and it was final. Zach hired a lawyer, a ruthless one, from what Margaret could tell. She had heard the rumors about him, a man known for his cutthroat tactics, willing to do whatever it took to win. Margaret wasn't intimidated. She had Helen on her side, someone who had been with her through thick and thin, someone who knew the law and knew how to fight. The exchange of legal papers began. Zach's lawyer fired off a series of sharp, aggressive letters accusing Margaret of malicious intent, trying to paint her as the villain. The claims were outrageous, twisting the facts in every way possible, but Margaret wasn't rattled. She had been living with the manipulation for so long, she was finally learning how to see through it. Zach's emotional pressure didn't stop either. His text became more pleading, accusing her of destroying their family, of being selfish. But each time she read his words, something inside her hardened, a resolve that had been buried for so long finally coming to the surface. One evening as the court date loomed closer, Margaret was sifting through some old emails when she came across something that made her pause. It was a conversation between Zach and his lawyer, buried in the exchange of legal documents, a message about the trust clause, but with one line in particular that caught Margaret's eye. "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on the trust documents before the hearing. It could change everything." Her heart skipped. Was this what he had been hiding all along? A secret, something he had been manipulating behind her back. Margaret read the line again, and the weight of it slammed into her chest. This wasn't just a battle for money. It was a battle for control of her life. Zach had been planning this for far longer than she had realized, using every tool he could to manipulate her, to make her feel small. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Helen. Margaret's stomach churned as she opened it. I think I found something in the family trust documents that changes everything. Helen's message read. Margaret's hands shook as she read the words again. What could this be? What could possibly change the course of everything? Her mind raced. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, and the ground under her feet was shifting with every passing second. With a deep breath, Margaret stood up and grabbed her coat. She wasn't going to wait anymore. It was time to face whatever was coming, head on. She drove to Helen's office, her thoughts swirling, her heart pounding. What was the new discovery? Was it the breakthrough she had been waiting for? Or was it a trap? Something more to keep her locked in this never-ending cycle of manipulation. She walked into the office, and Helen was already waiting for her. The trust documents laid out on the desk. Margaret didn't sit down, she couldn't. Margaret, Helen said, her voice serious, what I found could change everything. Margaret's chest tightened as she leaned in. Tell me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Helen hesitated, then pushed a document across the desk. The clause you've been fighting over. It's not just about the house. There's more, far more, that you don't know. Margaret stared at the document, the truth unfolding in front of her like a storm on the horizon. What had she missed? And more importantly, how would she stop it? The game had changed again. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension as Margaret sat across from Zach, her heart pounding in her chest. The table between them felt like a battleground. Every document, every word exchanged, charged with the weight of their years of broken trust and pent-up resentment. The judge, a woman with sharp, unreadable eyes, glanced at the documents in front of her. Miss Miller, she addressed Zach's lawyer, her voice firm. Do you have any new evidence to present? Zach's lawyer, a man in a crisp suit with a cold smile, stood up, his eyes flicking toward Margaret. He had been quiet throughout most of the proceedings, but now he was ready to make his move. Your Honor, he said, his voice smooth as he placed a file on the table. We have recently discovered new evidence that changes the entire foundation of this case. Margaret's stomach twisted. What new trick was Zach pulling now? The lawyer opened the file, pulling out a stack of financial documents that made Margaret's blood run cold. He spread them out on the table, facing the judge. As you can see, Your Honor, Margaret Miller has significant outstanding debt, missed mortgage payments, credit card balances that have gone unchecked for months, and several other financial obligations she's failed to meet. He paused, letting the silence hang. This is evidence that despite her claims of financial responsibility, Ms. Miller is far from solvent, and these issues should call into question her ability to make sound financial decisions, decisions that would affect the family trust. Margaret's breath caught. She wasn't prepared for this. She had kept her financial troubles to herself, trying to manage them quietly without anyone knowing. She had never imagined that Zach, of all people, would use her vulnerabilities against her. The room seemed to shrink as the lawyer continued, laying out the details with a chilling efficiency. It is clear that Ms. Miller's financial instability is a key factor in this case. Her actions have been reckless, and we believe they undermine her capacity to challenge the trust in a meaningful way. Margaret sat still, feeling the sting of every word, but as the judge scribbled notes, something inside her stirred anger, fear, and something else, resolve. She had spent years making excuses for Zach, supporting him even when it hurt her, and now he was using her mistakes against her. It felt like she was being cornered from all sides, but Margaret wasn't going to let him win this time. She could feel the courtroom's eyes on her as she stood up, the room quieting in anticipation. She looked at Zach, sitting across from her, a smug grin still on his face, as if he had already won, but Margaret's voice came out steady, calm and full of resolve. This, she said, pointing to the documents on the table, is exactly what he's been planning all along. The room shifted. Zach's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at his lawyer, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Do you think I didn't know?" she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Do you think I didn't realize how you've been using my vulnerabilities against me for years? How you've manipulated me with threats and promises, pushing me into this corner where I'm supposed to feel guilty, where I'm supposed to feel like I owe you everything?" Zach looked like he wanted to speak, but Margaret raised a hand, silencing him. "I've been cleaning up your messes, Zach. I've been your safety net for far too long. But you've been setting me up for this moment, haven't you?" Her voice was sharp now, and her eyes met his with a coldness he had never seen before. "Every missed payment, every financial disaster, this was all part of your plan to manipulate me, to use me. And now you're using my own mistakes to take away my dignity." Zach's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but the judge cut him off. "Mr. Reed, please let Miss Miller speak." Margaret could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she didn't back down. "I've kept all the receipts, Zach, all the evidence of your manipulation. Every time you came to me asking for money, asking for bailouts, promising that things would get better, but they didn't, did they? And you knew they wouldn't, because this was never about family, this was about control, your control." She turned to the judge, her voice even now, as if the storm inside her had finally passed. "Your Honor, I am not the villain here. Zach has been playing this game for years, and I'm done being the pawn. I'm not here to make excuses for my mistakes, but I refuse to let him manipulate me any longer." Zach looked like he was about to erupt, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "Thank you, Miss Miller," she said, her tone much softer than before. She turned to the lawyer and said, "Miss Reed, we will take a recess. I need time to review the additional evidence." As the judge called for a break, Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. She had confronted Zach in front of everyone, but now she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. The battle wasn't over yet, but she had taken control. Zach stormed out of the room, his face flushed with anger. Margaret watched him go, the weight of his fury barely grazing her now. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was no longer on the defensive. She wasn't sure how the rest of this fight would play out, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. The tables had turned, and now it was Zach's turn to face the consequences of his action. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, Margaret glanced at her phone, which buzzed with a new message from Helen. "I think I found something in the trust documents that changes everything." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. What could this be? What had Helen found? The storm was far from over, but Margaret felt herself standing taller, ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge took her seat, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on the papers before her. Margaret felt the weight of the silence, a tension thick enough to choke her. The minutes seemed to stretch out into hours as the judge reviewed the evidence, her face unreadable. Margaret's hands were clammy, and she could feel the nervous energy buzzing under her skin. She had confronted Zach, exposed his manipulation, and put herself on the line. Now it was up to the judge to decide. Zach sat across from her, his jaw clenched, his body tense. He hadn't said a word since the break, but his eyes burned with barely contained rage. Margaret could feel it, but it didn't touch her now. She had already braced herself for the fallout. She was no longer afraid of him. The judge looked up, and the room fell silent. "I have reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," she began, her voice steady. "I find in favor of Margaret Miller. The clause in question is dismissed. The claim to her assets by her son, Zach Miller, is invalid." The words hit Margaret like a wave crashing onto the shore. For a moment, she felt lightheaded, as if she might collapse right there in her seat. But then, a flood of relief rushed through her, sweeping away the years of tension, the constant fear of losing everything. She had won, but the relief was short-lived. The emotional toll of everything she had gone through crashed over her all at once. The last few months, the years of manipulation, the constant battle for her dignity, it had all led to this moment, and yet the victory didn't feel as sweet as she had imagined. Zach's face twisted with anger, but there was something else there now, something vulnerable. He looked like a man who had lost everything, a man who knew he had been defeated. He opened his mouth to speak, but Margaret stood up, not waiting for him to continue. "You don't get to take from me anymore," Margaret said, her voice steady but full of finality. "This is over." Zach's eyes widened. "Mom, please. I didn't mean it like this," he said, his voice cracking, the weight of the loss settling in. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I didn't know how else to handle everything." Margaret looked at him, her heart tight with a mix of emotion. A part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to forgive him, but another part knew that the damage was done. He had taken so much from her already, her time, her money, her trust, and now he was asking for her forgiveness as though it could undo everything. "No, Zach," Margaret said, her voice quieter now, but stronger than ever. "The damage is done. I can't undo the years I've lost, the parts of myself that I gave up just to keep you happy. But I'm done. I'm done letting you use me." Zach looked defeated, and for a brief moment, Margaret felt a pang of sympathy, but it quickly faded. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself for him. Not anymore. The courtroom was still as the judge gave her final ruling, marking the end of the case. Margaret's eyes stayed fixed on Zach, as if she was seeing him for the first time, broken, angry, but still capable of manipulating those around him. Zach stood, his shoulders slumped, and slowly made his way out of the courtroom. He didn't look back. Margaret didn't either. She had made her choice. It was over. The courtroom emptied quickly, and Margaret walked out, her heart heavy but clear. The sun was shining outside, the air crisp, but she felt like a weight had been lifted. She had fought for her life, for her dignity, and now she could finally breathe. The weeks that followed were filled with new beginnings. Margaret started rebuilding her life slowly, carefully, but with a sense of purpose. She set boundaries with those who had taken advantage of her kindness, and for the first time she found peace. She spent more time with her friends, doing things she had put off for years. She took long walks, letting the quiet of the world around her soothe her soul. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Her phone buzzed one evening as she was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping tea. She picked it up and saw Zach's name flashing on the screen. For a moment she hesitated, the old reflex to answer tugging at her. But she knew better now. She swiped the message open. "We're family, and family sticks together."